The hall light stayed on past midnight, casting a thin gold seam beneath the bedroom door like a wound that refused to close, and that was how Mara knew the truth would not sleep tonight. The apartment smelled like citrus cleaner and rain-soaked wool, the kind of smell that should have meant safe and ordinary, but every sound, every drip from the kitchen faucet felt like a countdown she couldn't stop. She lay on top of the comforter, shoes still on, keys pressed into her palm hard enough to leave crescent moons, pretending she wasn't waiting for the lock to turn, pretending she didn't already know who Lena had become when Mara wasn't invited to see it. What Mara wanted was small and enormous at once. The life they had promised in whispers, grocery lists, and paint samples. The life that grew like a bright vine from a rent-controlled balcony and always managed to find sun. What stood in the way was the ghost of another woman's perfume on Lena's scarf, the gradual thinning of laughter, the way Lena's phone began to live face down and quiet as a closed door, and the longer Lena stayed late at the clinic doing charts, the more the light stayed on and wouldn't look away. Mara had written a letter over 3 nights, a letter that used simple words like please and stay and don't choose this, a letter that folded into a trembling square she tucked inside Lena's favorite jacket, the blue one Lena wore when she needed courage. It said the thing Mara couldn't say without breaking into shards: I know, but I still want us, and I don't know how to want anything else. At 12:47, the lock turned slow as if Lena were negotiating with it, and then Lena stood in the doorway with rain in her hair and a gaze that took in everything except Mara's eyes. The letter was already open in Lena's hand, soft from being folded and unfolded, and there was a smudge on the corner where a teardrop had landed and dragged the ink like a small flood. I saw it at the clinic, Lena said, voice uneven, in my locker, and the word locker felt like a betrayal itself, because it proved how far the letter had traveled alone, how far Mara had already been left behind. Mara didn't stand because she was afraid of what standing might unleash: teeth of anger, pieces of language shaped like weapons, and instead she said the smallest possible truth: I want you to pick us. Lena nodded like someone agreeing to put down a heavy thing, only her hands stayed empty, and she said the name that had occurred in Mara's mind like a bruise: Elise, so quietly that the name felt like it was hiding from itself. It started when I couldn't breathe at work, Lena said, and Elise listened like she knew the map of my breath, which was the sort of sentence that should have been beautiful and instead tasted like metal in Mara's mouth. What did she give you that I didn't? Mara asked, not to compare, not to tally, but because she needed one true fact to hold when the floor turned to water. Lena's face changed, the kind of grief that looks like confession and looks like defense, and she said, silence that didn't ask me to be okay, and it landed between them like a dropped glass, and Mara wondered if all along she had been too loud with her love, too certain, too full of light that made shadows feel ashamed. I can be quiet, Mara said, and the desperation in it made her want to swallow her voice whole, but she let it stand, because love should sometimes be pathetic if it wants to be honest. Lena stepped closer, rain bright on her eyelashes, the scent of someone else's bergamot trailing a story through the room, and rested the letter on the dresser like a fragile thing that still had work to do. I haven't touched her since I found this, she said, fingers splayed as if to prove emptiness, and for a moment an impossible door cracked open inside Mara, a door labeled maybe, a door labeled fight. Outside, a siren stitched the city to itself and unstitched it again. Inside, Mara stood and felt the gravity of all the days behind them and all the days ahead, and the room held its breath. Then choose, Mara said, and the quiet afterward was not empty at all. It was crowded with the lives they could still have and the lives already closing like flowers at dusk. Lena closed her eyes and the minutes elongated, hot and trembling, and when she opened them the truth was there like dawn that did not ask permission. I don't know how yet, she said, hands shaking, but I want to choose us if you'll let me learn the way back. Mara's heart lifted and sank in the same beat, the open loop tightening, the hook of hope lodging deeper, and she nodded once like a survivor learning to walk again. They slept without touching, both on top of the quilt, as if touch were a country they had to earn visas for, and the hall light stayed on all night, refusing mercy. In the morning, Lena brewed coffee and poured it into the blue mug Mara loved, and the steam rose like a small prayer that knew better than to promise, and Mara sipped and felt the thin burn and thought, if this is how it starts again, I will allow it to be clumsy and real. Before leaving for the clinic, Lena placed her phone face up on the counter, a gesture so simple it felt like architecture, and said, I'll call Elise today, and the air changed temperature, like weather deciding whether to spare a roof. Mara watched the door close and pressed her palms together until heat pooled, whispering to the apartment, to her ribs, to the frightened animal of her heart, we will not survive on denial. We will survive on the fruit of every hard, honest word we can manage, and we will tend to the small orchard of trust as if storms were already gathering. The light stayed on even after sunrise as if to witness, and Mara didn't turn it off because there are some wounds that shouldn't be covered in darkness, not at first, not when there is still a chance the scar might teach something you can use. Outside, the day began, the city humming with the way lives continue, and Mara picked up a pen and wrote the first rule on a sticky note. No heroic silence, only brave speaking, even if the voice shakes. By the end of the week, the apartment was a testing ground, every surface a site of proof or failure, and the smallest gestures were evidence entered into a trial neither of them had agreed to, but both were attending like their futures were on the stand. Lena texted her locations without being asked, calendar screenshots punctuated by small apologies that looked like thread, and Mara tried to read them as offers rather than guilt, tried to accept without keeping a ledger that would later become a weapon. The second rule went on the wall beside the stove. No forensic accounting of pain. If it needs counting, count breaths taken together, count dinners cooked without crying, count mornings that arrive soft. They met Elise on a Tuesday at a cafe with windows tall as confessions. Elise had asked for it, said she would own the harm she helped create. And Mara said yes because refusing would make Elise into a myth when she needed her to be a human with flaws and teeth. Elise was smaller than the story in Mara's head, her smile careful, her hands steady around a cup of mint tea. And she looked at Mara first, not Lena, as if she understood the shape of the room and where the gravity was. "I hurt you," Elise said without ornament, and the simplicity enraged and relieved Mara at once. Because for weeks she had been fighting shadow versions of this woman, and now there was only a person who knew how to say a sentence clean. "What did you think you were giving her?" Mara asked. "Because there is no way back that doesn't demand new vocabulary," and Elise didn't look away. She said, "A harbor, then I realized I was building it from driftwood stolen from your house." And Mara visualized the splinters and the theft and the water you can drown in even while touching shore. Lena's jaw tightened at the edge of that truth, and she reached under the table for Mara's wrist. A quiet anchoring, a pledge to not run from the sting, and Mara let it happen because this was what wanting them meant. Letting the hurt be part of the room without letting it be the only furniture. "I ended it the day I read her letter," Lena said, nodding toward Mara's hand, and the word ended felt like a bridge that still creaked but held weight, and Elise accepted it with a small bow that looked like surrender to what is right. After, on the walk home, Rain decided to rehearse on the street before the real performance, and they shared a hood, their cheeks touching by accident and declaration, and the city grew a little less sharp against their skin. Mara wanted to ask if Elise would stay away forever, write an oath in ink on her doorframe, but the third rule pulsed. No contracts written in fear, only practices repeated until they become muscle memory. At home, Lena laid her phone on the table and opened her inbox and gave Mara the passwords like keys to rooms she could enter or not. It wasn't about surveillance, not really. It was about not asking Mara to live on imaginary floor plans. Trust grew like a bruise in reverse. First the darkest ring, then the light returning from the middle outward, and sometimes it startled Mara, the way the body wants repair if you make space for it. But some nights the hall light still glared, and Mara would lie awake listening for inflections. When Lena laughed in her sleep, was it memory or dream? Was it a thing Mara could hold or a thing already gone? And the questioning itself was a kind of burn that made everything taste faintly of smoke. "Ask me out loud," Lena would whisper, turning onto her back, and Mara would. And they would sit up against the headboard like two people remembering how to read a map in the dark, and the room would cool around the truth. It was Lena who suggested couples therapy on a Saturday when the sky couldn't decide on weather, and they took the subway to a brownstone that smelled like eucalyptus and old books. The therapist's name a soft vowel that made hard subjects feel slightly less serrated. The therapist said words like rupture and repair, but what made a difference were the questions that landed like pebbles in a pond and sent rings out for days. When did you first abandon yourself in this relationship? How did silence become a love language here? Mara admitted she had been proud of not needing, of being the steady one, of holding the ceiling up with her back, and Lena admitted the pressure to be the sun had made her crave night, and the shame melted just enough to leave room for design. They built rituals out of attention. A nightly 5-minute exchange where each spoke without interruption. A Sunday walk to the ferry terminal to watch departures and arrivals and remember movement can be chosen. A midweek rule to name one delight in the other that wasn't about usefulness. The fourth rule, written in blue pen near the shoes by the door, said, "We do not weaponize what the other gives in trust. If a story is handed over, it isn't ammunition. If a fear is named, it isn't a leash." The apartment softened, edges rounding off, the light over the hall becoming less of a judge and more of a witness. A long yellow line that said, "We are still here, we are still trying." And yet the obstacle returned in new costumes. An email from the clinic signed E that turned out to be from accounting, a canceled dinner when a patient spiraled, a sudden quiet in Lena that Mara could not parse. And each time Mara felt the old elevator drop in her chest and had to decide. Ask or assume, breathe or burn. "Choose me in the question," Lena said one night, holding Mara's chin like a delicate hinge, not after the answer, and it was the kind of instruction that rearranged furniture in Mara's mind, created a clear path between door and table. Still, the hall light stayed on some nights, and that was honest too, because hope is not a switch, it's a dimmer that can be turned by two hands or one shaking one. On a Thursday, Elise sent a single message: "I've requested a transfer. I won't be at the clinic after next month," Wishing you both steadiness, and Mara read it out loud and waited for the ache and was surprised to feel something else. Relief braided with gratitude that someone had chosen the right distance and made it easy to maintain. They cooked eggplant with too much garlic and ate on the floor because the table suddenly seemed formal, and the laughter that arrived didn't feel borrowed or rehearsed. It felt like a small animal that had been hiding under the couch and finally decided it was safe to come out. When they went to bed, the hall light hummed like always, but Mara flicked it off for the first time since the night of the letter, and darkness settled like trust does when it stops performing and simply exists. Healing, it turned out, had its own weather. Sudden squalls on cloudless afternoons, unseasonable warmth in January, a fog that made the next 5 feet visible, and the rest a rumor you learned to live with. Mara took a temporary leave from the second job she'd said she loved but secretly loathed, and in the quiet she noticed how much of herself she had outsourced to productivity, how much of her worth was tied to being the person who never wobbled. She bought a cheap guitar from a pawn shop and taught her fingers to ache in new ways, notes buzzing imperfectly until they coalesced into something that felt like a new kind of spine. Lena enrolled in a trauma-informed training she had been avoiding, not because she didn't care but because it asked her to look at her own. And she cried on the subway, not from shame but from the relief of naming the old shapes that had driven her to overfunction and then to escape. At home, she told Mara stories about childhood kitchens where emotions were salted like food until numbness tasted normal. And Mara told Lena about a mother who loved by predicting disasters and saving everyone from them, and they compared notes like survivors trading maps. The fifth rule went over the sink: we forgive quickly but not cheaply. Repair requires the cost of changed behavior paid in installments we can both see. Then came the test that did not announce itself as a test. Lena's mother fell, a hip shattering with the crisp cruelty of porcelain, and Lena became a daughter again overnight, driving back and forth to a town that smelled like her old fear. Mara packed a bag with snacks and playlists and tenderness and watched as the clinic piled messages. The family group chat sprouted opinions like invasive vines, and Lena's face became the quiet mask she'd worn when she first met Elise. "Don't disappear to be strong," Mara said at midnight by the sink, both of them holding glasses of water they didn't really want. "Disappear if you need rest, but not to carry what isn't yours alone." And Lena nodded and put her cheek in Mara's palm like a released bird. Still, the old muscle memory pulled. Lena skipped therapy twice in a row, answered messages after midnight, forgot to eat and then pretended she'd eaten, and Mara felt the hall light begging to be turned on again, an ache in her thumb to flick it and watch it burn. Instead, she wrote a note and taped it to the switch. "Turn me on if we've stopped telling the truth. Otherwise, let me rest," and the physical ritual of walking to the switch and choosing against the old reflex became a form of devotion. The sixth rule joined the others: we do not confuse crisis with the right to abandon our agreements. Fear can be an explanation, not a permission slip. On a Sunday, Mara drove and Lena slept in the passenger seat with her mouth open, the kind of sleep that only comes when someone else is holding the wheel. And when they arrived at the rehab center, Lena woke and gripped Mara's knee and said, "Thank you for not requiring me to be a lesson while I'm learning." And the sentence settled in Mara like warmth. In the waiting room, they met a woman whose father kept asking for his keys, and when she cried, she apologized to the room, and Mara handed her a tissue and said, "No one has to be tidy to be loved," and later realized she was speaking to herself as much as to anyone. They ate vending machine almonds in the parking lot like communion, and the sky put on a show of pinks that felt almost indecent in their abundance. And for once, Mara didn't apologize to the sky for feeling happy in the middle of someone else's pain. But then the call came at 2:12 a.m., the kind of hour that makes truths echo. Lena didn't see it, and Mara watched the screen light the ceiling with a name she didn't expect: Elise. The preview read only 2 words. "Urgent please," and Mara's body remembered what drowning felt like even as her mind moved toward the surface to breathe. She woke Lena with the gentleness reserved for dangerous news and handed her the phone, and waited at the threshold of the old house in her chest where argument had lived. Lena answered, hands shaking, and put the phone on speaker, and Elise's voice arrived thin with panic. There had been a patient at the new hospital, a disaster with sedation, and Lena had consulted on the protocol months ago. Elise was calling not to reopen doors but to ask for the key to the safe where Clarity lived. The room did its old trick of stretching time until each syllable could be inspected, and Mara watched Lena choose in real time. She steadied her tone, offered the necessary steps, sent the PDF with the addendum she'd written since the training, and then added, without prompting, "I can't be your harbor. Here is the shore," a line that felt like a spell that turned a highway back into a path. After the call, Lena set the phone face up again, not for points, not for proof, but because the practice had become the muscle that moved without thought, and Mara found herself crying, not from fear, but because the part of her that had expected the worst was finally out of a job. In the morning, they made pancakes and burned the first batch and ate them anyway, and Mara laughed with syrup on her chin, and Lena kissed it off and said, "We are learning to be human at the same time," and it sounded like an oath and a relief. On the subway, a child pointed at a dog and said, "He has eyebrows," and the entire car laughed together, and Mara stored the image like a charm against future storms. That night, the hall light stayed off without ceremony, and the darkness was warm as a full pocket. Summer arrived and made the city smell like hot bread and bus breaks, and their apartment breathed with the rhythm of two people who had rebuilt without raising, who had learned to leave the load-bearing walls and replace what made the rooms unsafe. The clinic approved Lena's proposal for a pilot program on caregiver fatigue, and Mara hung the acceptance email on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a lemon. Because lemons mean what happens when you squeeze and what you make when you mix it with sugar and water and time. The seventh rule, written in Lena's handwriting for the first time, said, "Joy is not a betrayal of what hurt, it is the proof that hurt did not devour us." They hosted friends for dinner and did not perform wellness. When Mara's voice shook telling the story of the hall light, the room did not try to fix it or make it pretty. And afterward on the balcony, someone said the moon looked like a coin the sky had forgotten in its pocket, and Mara decided to keep that sentence for the hard days. There were still hard days. A bill that made Mara's stomach drop, a patient Lena lost that sank her for 2 afternoons, a memory that arrived uninvited when a song one of them hadn't heard since college slipped into the kitchen like an old roommate. But the rules on the wall were no longer just ink, they were habits, and habit is the quiet faith that refuses to ask for applause. Then came the worst good news. Lena's mother stabilized enough to be discharged, but she refused the care plan and demanded Lena move back home for a while that sounded like a season disguised as a week. The request scratched at old doors. Lena's eyes flicked to the hall like she could see the light even when it was off, and Mara felt the familiar cold of her shoulders lifting to hold a roof, and they both stood in the kitchen with the question hovering like a fly they couldn't swat. "I can go," Lena said, the sentence shaped like penance, "if you come on weekends," and Mara saw the trap not because of malice but because of muscle memory. Abandon now to prove love, return later to collect interest. "No," Mara said, soft as bread, firm as oak, and Lena flinched because no has always been a door somewhere else slamming, but this one opened here. "We will not move out of our life to prove we have one," Mara said. "We can stay and still care," and the relief that moved across Lena's face made Mara's knees want to give. They designed a schedule that was not a sacrifice altar but a bridge. Lena would commute 2 days, a nurse would come 3, Mara would handle the paperwork labyrinth, and on Fridays they would do something stupid on purpose, bowling with bad neon shoes, watching old game shows, to honor the version of them that existed before any crisis asked to be fed. When they told Lena's mother, she wept and called them selfish, and Lena didn't fold herself into a smaller shape this time. She said, "I love you, here is what love looks like now," and the sentence did not shatter the kitchen, it strengthened it. The climax arrived not with a bang but with a storm that held traffic hostage, the kind of rain that makes the city forgive itself for being loud. Elise's name appeared again, this time in the subject line of a departmental memo about a conference where Lena would keynote a panel on ethical boundaries. An irony that would have gutted Mara 6 months earlier and now only pricked. The proof not that pain had vanished, but that it had aged into something that could be carried without bleeding. "Do you want me there?" Mara asked, and Lena's yes arrived like light through blinds, and they went together and wore their best thrifted blazers and held hands when no one was looking and sometimes when everyone was. On stage, Lena told the truth without self-immolation. That infidelity is not a love story but a flight response wearing expensive shoes, that repair is not forgiveness on sale but a practice purchased daily, that boundaries are the architecture that lets tenderness live with its shoes off. Elise asked a question from the audience about institutional support, and Lena answered it like any other question, and the world did not tilt, and Mara felt the strangest sensation. Boredom where fear used to be, the blessed ordinary of something that had once been a 4-alarm fire. After, on the sidewalk, the rain had washed the air clear, and they looked at each other like two people who had come back from a wilderness with a map instead of a myth. They walked home slowly, buying peaches that bruised if you looked at them wrong and carrying them like treasure. And in the kitchen, juice ran down Mara's wrist and Lena licked it off, and they laughed like thieves who'd stolen back their own names. "Turn it on," Lena said suddenly, nodding toward the hall, and Mara did, and the light flooded the narrow space, too bright, too honest, and they stood there together and watched it, not as punishment, not as a sentinel, but as a monument to a night when they had chosen to speak instead of disappear. "We kept the light," Mara said, "but it doesn't keep us," and Lena rested her forehead against Mara's and answered, "We keep us," and it was not poetry, it was instructions. They made a new list, not for the wall but for the inside of their lungs. "We are allowed to be terrified and brave on the same day. We will not outsource our safety to each other's secrets. We will go to bed angry if anger is the honest bridge to morning. We will kiss like we might forget and then remember." Later, under that light, they ate too late noodles and argued about whether cilantro tastes like soap, and then they danced in their socks to a song with a ridiculous chorus, because the body sometimes demands joy with a volume that embarrasses sorrow into silence. When the light finally clicked off, it was because the bulb, after months of uncomplaining service, simply reached the end of its life, and the darkness that arrived was not empty. It was full of the soft sounds of a home still inhabited by two people who had learned to tell the truth, even when it cost them everything they didn't need.